Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's lecture. I'm Aaron Glass, anthropologist on the faculty here at Bard Graduate Center. And on behalf of our Dean and Director, I'd like to welcome you to this third and final lecture in our annual series, Indigenous Arts in Transition. While the majority of you on Zoom are widely distributed in space and in time, actually, for those watching recordings in the future, those of us hosting this event here and now in this room are located on the island of Mannahatta in the heart of Lenape-Hoking, the ancestral territories of the Lenni Lenape, and a past, present, and future home to many indigenous peoples, as well as many other peoples who arrived on these shores as the result of forced displacements under colonialism, imperialism, slavery, and warfare, something all too present in the world at the moment. The twin legacies of colonial displacement and cultural mobility and persistence will be a main theme of tonight's conversation. So I'm thrilled to introduce our speaker, Dr. Paul Basu, who has been working for decades to critically re-examine colonial collections from the perspective of both history, the history of anthropology, and current descendant communities. He is presently visiting professor in the Department of Anthropology at University College London. Previous positions included Professor of Anthropology and Director of Museum, Heritage, and Material Culture Studies program at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London, and Professor of Anthropology and Cultural Heritage Studies at UCL's Institute of Archaeology. Since 2006, Paul has been the recipient of numerous grants to coordinate innovative, often collaborative international research, exhibition, and digital media projects that activate and mobilize museum collections, colonial archives, and West African and Scottish communities, both in their home nations and in diaspora. Early training in film and filmmaking brings a particular visual acuity to his work with art, material culture, and photography in particular, and is evident in the prominent role of film and media in his exhibition and web-based practices. Across numerous projects, connective threads are his deep and reflexive scholarly rigor, extended community engagements, commitment to ethical redress, and creative experimentation with media and museum methods. Paul's prolific output includes around 30 journal articles and chapters over the last 20 years, and his books include Highland Homecomings, Genealogy and Heritage Tourism in the Scottish Diaspora, 2007, Exhibition Experiments with Sharon MacDonald from the same year, Museums, Heritage, and International Development with a friend of the BGC, Wayne Modeste from 2015, and The In-Betweenness of Things, Materializing Mediation and Movement Between Worlds from 2017. His most recent and exceedingly impressive, in my view, exhibition, Re-Entanglements, Colonial Collections in Decolonial Times, currently on display at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology at Cambridge, and accompanied by an extensive website, is a component of his multi-partner research project, Museum Affordances. Together, these projects form the basis of his talk tonight, entitled Museum Affordances, Colonial Collections, Decolonial Possibilities. Finally, a word on how this will run. Paul will speak for about 50 minutes or so, give or take, and we'll open things up for discussion. There is a small audience here in the room with us tonight. And for those of you watching at home, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and we'll read out your questions. We have automatic captioning, which you can turn on using the CC option at the bottom of your screen, for those of you at home, not for those of you in the room. We are recording the event. A copy of the video will be available on our website and YouTube channel afterwards. And I'm pleased now to turn the microphone and the podium over to Paul. Paul, welcome.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Aaron. And thanks to everyone here at the Bard Graduate Center. It's a great privilege to be here. This is the second of three presentations that I'm making this week at the center relating to this project, as Aaron mentioned, entitled Museum Affordances, Re-Entanglements. This project has been concerned with addressing anthropology's historical entanglements with colonialism, and particularly how we might re-engage with the legacies of colonial anthropology as materialized in ethnographic archives and collections, and to re-engage in the present in what we might regard as our decolonial times. So yesterday I gave a bit of an overview of the project's activities over the last 4 years and explained how theoretically we've been mobilizing James Gibson's concept of affordance to reflect on what anthropology was perceived to afford to make possible historically in the context of colonial governments and ideology, and to consider whether the material traces, the debris even, of colonial anthropological projects might also have the potential to contribute to the ongoing project of decolonialism. So this evening, I'd like to focus on the kind of collections-based approach that we've been pursuing. To borrow the terminology of the surrealists, the ethnographic archive as a whole might be conceptualized as a found object, something encountered, perhaps redundant, perhaps out of context, perhaps no longer fulfilling its original purpose, discarded, filed away, forgotten, but which can be reappropriated to serve other purposes, even purposes contrary to or critical of original intentions. So the archive that we've been working with comprises thousands of documents, images, objects, sound recordings, dispersed in different institutions, seemingly obsolete records recorded using obsolete technologies, wax cylinders, glass plate negatives, fading ink on brittle paper, arcane methods of linguistic transcription of dialects no longer spoken. Here I want to focus on just 4 objects among this sea of material: a document, a photograph, a sound recording, and an artifact. These at least will be the starting points from which I want to gather some thoughts on the entanglement of colonialism and anthropology and on the decolonial possibilities that such archival objects might present. As an anthropologist engaged in material, visual, and indeed sonic culture, as well as with people and institutions, I'm also interested in the work that these things might do themselves, for anthropologists addressing their disciplinary past, but also for other publics, other stakeholders. A while ago, I reread James Agee's Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, and I was struck by these words in his preface: the desire to do without words, to create work from photographs, fragments of cloth, records of speech, pieces of wood and iron, files of odors. This speaks to the sensory experience of encountering and working with these objects, the dust of the archive, the overpowering smell when opening a long shut crate in the museum store, the sensation of coming face to face with the subjectivities of those archived, imagining the gaze of the photographed face as it beholds us. It also speaks to an object-based methodology, an object-oriented ontology, reminding us that these objects, images, and sounds have their own ways of telling. So before turning to these 4 found objects, let me briefly introduce the materials that we've been working with. These are the archival traces of a series of anthropological surveys led by this man, Northcote Thomas, in southern Nigeria and Sierra Leone between 1909 and 1915. Thomas was the first government anthropologist formally appointed as such by Britain's Colonial Office, an early experiment with the use of anthropological expertise and methods in procuring knowledge to inform the implementation of indirect rule or native administration. This form of colonial government operated through the intermediary of local authorities and political structures, which required knowledge about local political institutions and social organizations. There was also a need to reconcile British colonial laws with what were characterized as local customs. In Britain, in the first decade of the 20th century, anthropology was keen to establish itself as a university discipline but also as a practical field science. Anthropologists themselves repeatedly lobbied government to impress upon it the value of the discipline to colonial administration. Anthropologists were keen to assert the discipline's governmental affordances. Yet this was far from being proven, and Thomas's appointment was explicitly regarded as being experimental. As it happened, Thomas's surveys came to be regarded as a failure. This was due to many factors, including Thomas's difficult personality, the challenge of extracting information of practical value from the mass of material that Thomas documented, resistance from colonial administrators who saw this as a misguided initiative of the Colonial Office in London and who resented the interference of an academic in the practical business of governance, and the fact that the colonial governments were obliged to cover the not inconsiderable costs of this endeavour, which was regarded as having so little benefit. If Thomas's surveys did not fulfil the principal purpose for which they were intended, they have at least bequeathed to the present this remarkable, if problematic, archive. The existence of this archive is a consequence of the methods that Thomas employed, which were largely based on the guidance set out in the leading research handbook of the day, Notes and Queries in Anthropology. These ranged across physical anthropology and linguistics, as well as ethnography, and were essentially concerned with documentation and collecting, whether specimens of language recorded on wax phonograph cylinders, specimens of tribal types recorded photographically, or indeed specimens of material culture or primitive technologies acquired as part of an ethnographic collection. While the multi-volume reports that resulted from Thomas's surveys make for dull reading in their styleless cataloguing of customs and practices in the different locations Thomas toured, the largely unpublished, unseen and unheard archive of texts, photographs, sound recordings and artifacts constitute a quite remarkable multi-sensory ethnography, particularly when they converge on particular events that Thomas witnessed. For instance, this wrestling festival in Ottawa in the north of present-day Edo State. So you're seeing the bringing together through this project of collections that are dispersed in different institutions, field notes, photographic record, sound archives, the material culture, so you actually see the very drum that's being played and was subsequently collected by Thomas. This multimedia project of documentation anticipates much more recent claims to innovation around concepts of sensory ethnography and synesthetic montage. Through triangulating fragments of information written on labels, specimen cards, photo registers, and so on, it's been possible to reconstruct the survey itineraries of Thomas reasonably accurately. As a result, we've been able to retrace many of Thomas's journeys and bring these images, sounds, and images of objects to communities in Nigeria and Sierra Leone, whose cultural heritage they reflect. At the same time, we've also been engaging other publics online and offline in the UK, USA, and elsewhere, as well as in West Africa. And of course, there's much more to say about all of this. If you're interested, there's a website, entanglements.net, which has blog articles, maps, links to the collections, and much more. By selecting 4 objects here, telling just 4 stories, I'm of course also drawing attention to the thousands of stories that I'm not telling, the thousands of other found objects that I might have selected. Each document, photograph, sound recording, or artifact opens up a multitude of other stories. Stories that speak to the entanglement of anthropology and colonialism and the decolonial possibilities of the colonial anthropological archive. Needless to say, I've only a short time to discuss each of my 4 objects, so it'll have to be rather brief. They each kind of warrant a paper in themselves, but hopefully I can convey at least something of their significance. So on to my first found object. This is a document selected from among hundreds of similar documents in the UK's National Archives, through which one can assemble at least one version of the events surrounding the Colonial Office's first experiment with anthropology. Thomas conducted 4 surveys during his tenure as government anthropologist, 3 in what were then the Protectorate of Southern Nigeria and 1 in the Protectorate of Sierra Leone. Among other papers, this particular Colonial Office file includes a transcript report submitted by Thomas to the acting governor of Southern Nigeria, providing a summary of activities of the first 6 months of his second tour, which was focused in what was then Awka district, more or less corresponding to present-day Anambra State in Nigeria. Awka became the district headquarters of the colonial government, but prior to this, a place called Nri, spelt Ndre in this map of the period, just a few miles southwest of Awka, was the most important town in the region. This was the seat of the divine king, the Ezenri, with which the document that I'm looking at here is concerned. And I've chosen this document in particular because it highlights an incompatibility between the European and local cosmological order, exposed in the traditional practices of infanticide. While this was rendered into a racialized dichotomy between civilization and law on the one hand, and barbarism and custom on the other, it also raises ethical dilemmas that challenge the idealization of pre-colonial societies in the present and tests the limits of ethnographic relativism. In Thomas's report, we see the anthropologist's willingness to understand the logic of local practices in its own terms and to search for ways of mediating between colonial law and indigenous custom. The issue is the matter of so-called abominations in Igbo society, things that went against the cosmological order of the earth and which consequently could not be allowed to exist. Such abominations included children born as twins, breech-born children, and children who cut their top teeth first. Such children were seen as abominations and were often discarded and left to die in the bush. Of course, in the eyes and the laws of the colonial authorities, the killing of children constituted murder and could not be tolerated. Thomas argued that the solution lay in the hands of this figure, the Ezenri. The Ezenri is a divine king, and the town of Nri exerted a kind of ritual hegemony over much of the Igbo-speaking world. Thomas spent a good deal of time in Nri, and seems to have developed a respectful relationship with Obaliki, the reigning Ezenri at that time. A whole chapter of his published Igbo report was devoted to priestly kings, and this was largely focused on the Ezenri himself. In the unpublished report concerning twin killing, Thomas argued that the ritual authority of the Ezenri needed to be respected, and that the Ezenri alone could abrogate these prohibitions through ritual means. And it's important to note that the Ezenri, having ritually died as a man and been reborn as a deity, was himself subject to all kinds of prohibitions. It was not, for example, permitted for him to travel outside of Nri itself. So the documents in this file tell a story of how the colonial authorities were dismissive of the anthropologist's advice. In a written response to Thomas's report sent to acting Governor Boyle, the district commissioner S.W. Sproston rejects Thomas's assertions in the light of his own personal experiences as an administrator. In my view, he writes, the power of this individual, the Ezenri, has been overrated. Since the advent of the government in the country, the work of these priests has practically disappeared. End of quote. In a note about Thomas's report to the Colonial Office, Boyle adds his own view, citing an interpreter who, quote, was more knowledgeable of all the Igbo-speaking tribes than anyone else, and who denied absolutely that the Ezenri has any power outside his own village. In the event, Sproston demanded that the Ezenry travel to a meeting of the colonial native court in Orca, convened to discuss the issue of twin killing, forcing him to break the ritual prohibition not to leave Enri. Thomas was witness to this meeting, and he writes, "So great is the awe with which the Ezenry inspires, that the whole assembly rose and prepared to flee when he entered the court." Eventually, largely thanks to Thomas's insistence, a ritual abrogation of the abominations did take place in Enri in August 1911, but the humiliation inflicted on the sacred figure of the Ezenry is what is remembered with bitterness today. And although Ezenry Obelike lived until 1927, it is this episode in 1911 that marks the end of the centuries-old tradition of the Nri hegemony. Correspondence in this file shows that tensions between the colonial administration and Thomas persisted, and that there was resistance to supporting a third tour. Referring to the disagreement about the Ezenry's ritual power, the acting governor reported to the colonial secretary in London that, quote, "The incident shows that an anthropologist is not always of service from an administrative point of view, and that Mr. Thomas's presence in the district was more of a hindrance than otherwise." In the event, Thomas was engaged for a final tour in Nigeria, but once Frederick Lugard assumed governorship in 1912, he refused to support any further tours. Hence, Thomas's fourth and final survey took place in Sierra Leone. The office of the Ezenry continues. There is currently an interregnum. Since the Ezenry has already died as a human, he cannot die again, so he is said to be traveling. The walls of the palace are hung with the images of earlier incumbents. Until our fieldwork, the only known image of Obelike was that published in Thomas's report, which you can see just here. A somewhat blurry wide shot of Obelike's palace, with Obelike small in the frame, sitting on a stool with his retinue. A local artist, as you can see, top left, has made an imaginative sketch from the plate, but we were able to give gifts of copies of the photographs, including the portrait of Obelike himself, and these were received with much celebration. We were subsequently contacted by Prince Ben Akolo, the last surviving grandchild of Obelike. He currently lives in Lagos, but still keeps the family house in Enri. We presented him with an enlargement of the photograph of his grandfather. Although elderly, he is keen to memorialize his grandfather and protect the sacred land on which Obelike's palace stood, which is also Obelike's gravesite. Some years ago, he erected a small shrine there and also a display board, which again included a reproduction of the plate in Thomas's report. Now that we've been able to provide him with many other photographs of his grandfather and his palace, Prince Ben's wish is to open a museum on the site, and he insists that alongside photographs of his grandfather, there should be photographs of Northcote Thomas too, since he argues it is Thomas who has immortalized him in these images. So my next found object is a so-called physical type photograph. For many, these epitomize the objectifying violence of anthropology as a racial science. They're typically paired head and shoulder shots, full face and profile, like this example. In total, Thomas took around 7,500 photographs over the 4 tours, and about half of these were so-called physical type portraits. As you can see, these were pasted, or at least a large number of them were pasted into albums identified only by these numbers, corresponding numbers. So they immediately seem to confirm this idea that people were treated as little more than specimens to be collected vicariously through photography, ordered and analyzed according to spurious typologies. A few examples of these were included in Thomas's published reports, and when they were published, they had captions such as these, which again reduced individuals to tribal types: Susu boy, Limba girl, Temni woman, Karanko man. Apart from these published examples, and there are literally no more than a handful in these reports, no use was found for these thousands of images. Despite the huge amount of effort that went into producing them, certainly the colonial governments and the Colonial Office had absolutely no interest in them. So there's sometimes a misunderstanding that anthropologists like Thomas were working at the behest of the Colonial Office, and as it were, that directive was coming from above, that this kind of work should be undertaken. This was something that Thomas was kind of allowed to do on the side, as it were, things that were regarded as being purely scientific interest. And I tend to agree with Elizabeth Edwards, a historian of kind of anthropological photography, that these photographs can perhaps best be understood in a performative way as being part of the performance, the professional performance of being an anthropologist, and that Thomas put so much energy into these simply because that's what anthropologists did. In fact, Thomas recorded the names and the locations for many of those, the majority of those he photographed. And so we can see here this young man who was labeled simply Susu boy in the report. We actually know that his name is Momo Samora. And we know where this was taken, in a place called Samaya in present-day Bombali district in Sierra Leone. And of course, the naming of the physical type portraits opens up the possibility of identifying descendants of those photographed. And indeed, as we've retraced Thomas's itineraries, we've been able to reunite many people with their images of their ancestors. But this also opens up entirely different ways of reading these traces of colonial violence. And that's as indeed treasured representations of ancestors. The photographs are not reducible only to physical types. And indeed, closer examination of the photographs themselves suggests that photography provided a means to mediate relationships in the field. Even though they were often included in Thomas's albums as physical types, many of them are in fact honorific photographic portraits. And this is especially true of his photographs of elites. These are examples of that, chiefly lineages and so on, and the same would apply to the photograph of the Ezenri that I showed before. The return of these photographs are occasions for celebration. The colonial context of their production is of little interest. And the impact of this visual repatriation of ancestors is even greater in Nigeria. And this interacts, as it were, with a very distinctive kind of visual photographic culture. There are many digital studios in Nigeria, for instance, which regularly are really concerned with enhancing, making kind of super real, surreal photographs, if you like, of family events, weddings, christenings, title-taking ceremonies, and so on. And many people have extensive photographic galleries in their homes. And this is particularly true of customary rulers. Every town has an Igwe in Igbo-speaking areas, and you see the presentation of self through these enhanced photographs in many palatial homes. And this is about, in a way, the fact that ancestors are not dead at all, of course. They're not a part of the past, but of the present. When we've returned photographs, it's been interesting to see how they're reincorporated into the local culture, as it were, through these kind of visual enhancement. This is in a place called Nenis, the Igwe, and the Igwe's ancestor, who was also the kind of a warrant chief at the time Thomas visited. And you can see this kind of bringing to life of the ancestor, not something of the past, black and white represents pastness. Color represents being alive, being present. Here's another example of another family in Neni, in Bemina, and you can see how the photograph has been enlarged and framed in this photograph here by the present head of the family. But what's interesting is to see actually what's going on here, because in every elite family compound, there is an ancestral shrine, and we can see here the Mbemina family shrine here with an earlier representation of the ancestor, and this is a named individual too. So we can see photographically how something similar is happening. The archive photograph becomes a site of ancestral presence in the way that the shrine representation does. And interestingly, Thomas also photographed shrines like this. So we see a kind of full circle in a way. This again is the ancestral shrine in an elite compound that Thomas photographed. So we can see successive generations, as it were, an evolution of this into the kind of more three-dimensional representation of the shrine on the top right there, through back into a two-dimensional representation through these photographs. And the return of these photographic portraits also kind of intervenes in a kind of contemporary politics. And this is a rather interesting example, although there are many more. We kind of unwittingly visited a chiefdom in Sierra Leone, for instance, where there was a chieftaincy election going on. And there were contending lineages, chiefly lineages, and there was a kind of a lesser lineage that didn't have so much power, and yet it was their ancestor who Thomas photographed in 1914 in this case. And by us turning up with this image in this town, it caused quite a stir because, well, on the one hand, the other lineages thought that this was something that had been contrived, that this wasn't real, that somehow we'd been contacted and we come with this spurious image. Of course, that lineage was delighted because somehow, even though we didn't bring any new information, but the very presence of this photograph, this historical kind of presencing, made a big impact on their profile and their chances of winning this chieftaincy election. This is another example here in Nigeria, in Okpanam, in Delta State, and where this photograph of what was labeled as the Omu of Okpanam, who's a woman who has the status of a chiefly man. And she has this special status. I mean, Thomas described her as the queen of the market, but she has a much more significant role than that. There is still the role that the role of the Omu throughout this area of Delta State, and one of the privileges of that is to wear the red cap of chieftaincy. And in Okpanam, there had been a contestation of the present Omu, saying that she had no right to do this, that this was a made-up thing. So actually, when we came with the picture of the Omu of Okpanam wearing, even though it's a black and white photograph, it's known to be a chiefly red cap she's wearing. This supported her argument, and it again created a great stir. It may seem like a kind of a trivial thing, but actually it was a very serious political agenda, this recognition of this honored status, this, you know, a whole gendered competition over status and authority was settled by the return of this particular photograph. These reappropriations of the colonial anthropologist's photographs do not, of course, negate more critical readings. And this is something that we investigated through a short film entitled Faces, Voices, which features in the exhibition that Aaron mentioned at the moment. And you can also see that online at this URL here. I'm a bit concerned with time, so I shan't play a clip now. But basically what we did was work with a number of Londoners with African heritage, and basically participants looked at Thomas's photograph and relayed what they perceived in these photographs. And the most interesting thing is really the way in which the same photograph evoked very different responses from different participants. So it kind of, we spoke about this yesterday in more detail, challenging the singularity of this reading. The inscrutability of the gazes returned by the photographs acts as a mirror for the respondents' own positionalities and perspectives. Do check that out on the website if you like. For my third found object, you need to imagine me cranking the handle of an Edison photograph and playing this recording through its sound horn. So you can hear Thomas introducing the track at the start, record number 433, made in Orca, January the 25th, 1911, and then a song. Thomas made around 750 recordings of songs, stories, conversations, and what he termed specimens of language during his anthropological surveys. Thomas transcribed and conducted linguistic analysis on some of the recordings when writing up his surveys. But for the greater part of a century, these recordings have been unplayed until they were digitized by the British Library just a few years ago. Taking these recordings to the communities in which they were recorded is often very moving. They're not easy to listen to due to the noise and linguistic changes, but often a moment comes when a voice is heard, meaning becomes apparent, and people will suddenly hear indeed the voices of their ancestors. Ours has been the first serious work to actually understand what these recordings contain. And it's often surprising, not least the commentary that they provide from below about the experience of colonialism, though this is often couched in elliptical and indirect terms. We've worked with a couple of musicologists at the University of Nigeria and Nsukka, for example, on some of the Igbo recordings. Samson Eze worked on this particular song, the one that I just played, in which we hear the refrain in English, "The enemy keeps calling," a reference Eze is confident is to the British. The figure of the native clerk or clerk, Klaku, is also invoked. Like the warrant chiefs of this period, the clerk of the native court was in an ambiguous position, both a member of the local community, but also part of the native administration, the colonial native administration. They were often able to use their position to benefit themselves and their families, overturning existing hierarchies and social obligations. So does the song reprimand this brother for collaborating with the enemy? Does it warn him? Does it praise him? Samson Eze transcribed the recording and worked with a group of singers from Orca to re-record the song. And Eze explained to us that this body of recordings was hugely significant, both musicologically and as a historical source, especially as a resource for universities in Nigeria, which are also seeking to decolonize their curricula. And this access to an archive of pre-colonial or very early colonial recordings is extremely significant. And let me just play you a clip of Samson's re-recording. To date, we've only been able to find one recording. In fact, it's only a transcription that survives of a first-person narrative of someone Thomas also photographed. This is Onyeso. He was an important chief in Nri, the son of the Ezenri prior to Obaliki, who we met earlier. His speech is more explicit about the impact of colonialism on the existing cosmological order, through which the health of the people and the health of the land was maintained, and these two were very close. When the government came, he states, the town was spoiled. What we wondered if Thomas had recorded more such first-person narratives, and let me just play you a very brief. The original recording's lost, but we worked with some Igbo colleagues to reconstruct from Thomas's really quite idiosyncratic transcription the words.
Nna m bụ eze, ebu m ichi na-epughị eze. N'izu 14, nwa eze na-enwe eze. Ọ bụrụ na onwe.
Just a little clip to get some sense of that. As I say, so what we wondered would happen if we had the voices of more, bearing in mind we have these thousands of photographs of individuals for whom we seem to have no voice. And so this was the idea behind another filmic experiment in which we worked with 5 West African storytellers to give voice to some of the other people silenced in the anthropological archive. And the scripts that we developed were based on the knowledge that we could gather through the archives on each of these characters. But it was also, of course, an imaginative exercise. We're working with ideas of kind of speculative histories, but also, of course, with long-standing traditions of storytelling. And interestingly, we included not only, so we actually revoiced Onyeso's as one. One of the stories was about the perspective of children and their encounter with this anthropologist coming. Yenke, and I'll come on to, we included also an object, actually an Alusi, a deity, the representation of a shrine figure that is there in Geni. And we included the story of John. John was an assistant to Thomas, a local boy who Thomas actually requested be kept on a retainer after the first tour so that he could be trained in photography. And we see this character, John, appear in many of Thomas's photographs in the kind of edge of frame. So again, that story was very much about the ambiguity of this kind of uneasy collaboration with this colonial presence. But let me talk about Yenke a little bit then. So Yenke was, as you can see, this is Thomas's photographic register on the right there, was the head wife of the paramount chief of this particular place, Torma. And she was likely also a head person in the female Sande society. And the masks associated with this society, the kind of tutelar kind of spirit, is the Soe mask here. That and this is a photograph taken in Torma of the Soe there. We know also that Thomas was tried to be initiated into the male secret society, as they're called, the Poro Society, and was confounded in that by an acting district commissioner, and it was seen to her kind of breach a boundary between, a racialized boundary between the civilized white person and these, what were regarded as barbaric secret societies. We know Thomas also had a very difficult family relationship with his wife and 2 daughters. So from all of this kind of material, we work with the storytellers, and I'll play you Yankin's story. These are parts of an installation in the exhibition too.
I am Yankin. I am the first one. I am Bondo. I am the spirit of the women. Mr. Thomas, Pomui, you don't understand. With your white man's gaze, your mustache, your pith helmet, you overlooked our significance. In your register of photographs, against the number 6191, you wrote my name, Yankin, and added, head wife of Chief Siyebure of Toma, as if that label defines me. Hear me. The eyes of the dancing Sowe are cast down, mouth pursed small. These are our ideals of demure femininity. The blackness of my skin shines like Sowe's. But do you not see that I return your gaze, and my mouth is wide, ready to speak our truths? But I hold my tongue. Mr. Thomas, had it not been for that Jobsworth assistant DC, you would have been initiated into Poro at Yonibana and learned the secret of the men's society. They talk as if they know it all, but they do not know the half of it. Had you ventured into the Bondo bush and glimpsed the secret of our sisterhood, you would not have come out alive. Sowe is our teacher and our guide, but she is a fierce spirit. She would whip you with her switch. We say that the eyes talk. You turned away from my stare in embarrassment, but not before I heard your eyes speak. They spoke of an unhappy man who cared more for his books and notes than for his own wife and daughters.
The idea of these morphing faces and kind of going through these thousands of faces is to suggest that, you know, every single one of those photographs of the people that Thomas photographed, of course, had their own story, had their own response, could, as it were, answer back. Right, my last object is this clay pot bearing the figure of the deity Oligon. Oligon is one of the pantheon of Edo deities, and Thomas documented a number of Oligon shrines and related practices in Benin City and areas of present-day Delta State, Nigeria, during his first tour. Pots like these were placed on Oligon shrines and filled with water, sacred chalk, and other medicines. The water, chalk, and clay of the pot are significant insofar as Oligon is associated with rivers and the sea, and is a goddess of fertility. Sorry, I should show you this. This is an Oligon shrine that Thomas photographed, and some of his notes about this deity, Oligon. And Oligon shrines are still found in the region today, and there's a lot of art historical scholarship around these. We know that Thomas probably perched this pot alongside other pots, which were subsequently acquired by the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge, which holds most of the material culture collections that Thomas assembled. It was likely that Thomas acquired the pot at a market like this one. And this is photographed on the outskirts of Benin City. And we know that he acquired it in February or March 1909. We know also, however, that the pot was broken at some point, probably in transit from Nigeria to Cambridge, or possibly later after it had already been accessioned into the museum collection. It was evidently subsequently reconstructed, although, as you can see from these photographs, it was rather poorly done. This is how we found this object. And it struck me that we might regard this pot as a kind of material metaphor for the broader history of the colonial anthropological encounter. Through the clumsiness and violence of the anthropologists' inquiries, something whole, intact, and meaningful meaningful in its context is extracted, decontextualized, transplanted into the university museum, the laboratory of analysis, and in so doing is fundamentally broken, shattered, losing its integrity. Through scholarly intervention, the fragments are reconstructed, and at first sight, the reconstruction may resemble the original, but the trauma it has experienced is all too evident on closer inspection, and indeed the function that it once had to contain water is no longer possible. So what are we to do with these traces of that violent encounter that linger in museums, archives, and universities? One material intervention that we undertook was to commission a new Oligon pot to be made, but drawing on another artistic tradition for which Benin City is famous, brass casting. This skeuomorph presences the controversy surrounding the so-called Benin bronzes looted during the 1897 punitive expedition, a mere 12 years before Thomas's surveys, and some of the most contentious collections in European and American, I guess, museums, and subject of successive restitution demands. And this is displayed in the exhibition at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, and elsewhere in the museum there are indeed some examples of the 1897 looted bronzes, which are currently in the process of being repatriated. Another material intervention which sought to respect and care for the original object was to dismantle the previously repaired pot into its constituent fragments and to reassemble it once again using contemporary conservation techniques and materials. This painstaking work was undertaken by Carmen Vidra at the UCL Institute of Archaeology Conservation Labs. The point was not to hide the breakage and restore the pot to its original state, though that would have been possible, but to repair the pot in order to strengthen it and make it more resilient, whilst making the history of its damage apparent. This too suggests a reparatory metaphor that might be more widely applied in the project of decolonization. We recorded the reconstruction process using time-lapse video, compressing 26 days' work into 5 minutes. And I'd like to just play you a clip from this in which Carmen provides a kind of a voice over reflecting on the process as it unfolds.
Working with objects as a conservator, you sort of create a relationship with the object that is a very close one. For me, conservation is a lot about narrative. We are creating a narrative from the point in which we start understanding an object in its makeup, in its technology, in its materials, to the point at which we have received that object and we have to do something with it. And the narrative continues into the future because I have to make decisions as to, I'm the next stage in the history of that ceramic. I am not a neutral agent there. I'm not taking it back to what it was. I'm creating something new with what I've been given. And therefore, I have to make decisions based on that history, to carry on that history of the object. As a conservator, I have to make choices, and the next stage in the history of that pot I'm not a passive agent, I'm not neutral. I am doing things to it and making decisions as to how to put it back together, how to fill the gaps. Those fills will become part of the history of the object and part of its visual history as well. So I'm an agent in the history of the Olokun pot, but I'm hoping that I'm not a disassociated agent. That I'm an agent that at least is trying to be aware of the different stories and histories of the pot.
This idea of kind of creating something new with what we've been given goes to the heart, I think, of the serialist project of the found object, the idea of the found object. And it suggests one approach to me for how anthropology might work through its colonial entanglement, not hiding that past away or erasing the memory, but repurposing colonial legacies for decolonial futures. And that's where I'll leave my 4 objects.
Thank you, Paul. Can we borrow that film for our Conserving Active Matter show that opens next week? Which I'm gonna walk Paul through tomorrow. I have some questions for you, but first I'd like to open it up to the floor of the people in the room. And we'll be monitoring the Q&A online for those watching at home. So please submit questions to the Q&A. But for those of you who are in the room, submit questions with your hand in the air.
Thanks very much. This is a fascinating project. I wish I could go to Cambridge to see it. You mentioned the young man who was the photographic assistant to Thomas. What's his name?
John Osarbo. Yeah.
So you said in passing somewhat that he had it was an equivocal relationship, if you like. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that and why it might have been equivocal.
Sure. I mean, when I say that, that's part of the storytelling, the speculative history, in terms of his positionality. So in his story, that's the way we've interpreted it. Okay. Well, that's where the speculative history comes in, or the storytelling. So what we wanted to do with those different characters was to try and draw out different kind of aspects of that. So we had 5 characters. Onyesa was one where we actually had the actual words and so on. So we actually reenacted the very words which established the format for the others. And then there was the children's perspective. So again, through storytelling, imagining how all of those for whom we don't have a voice, we don't have a story. This is precisely the point. How do we give voice, okay, within the idiom of storytelling to these silent presences? So how would children engage with this? The perspective of women is very mute in all of this. Thomas, there was a bias towards male informants and the world of men. So part of the reason for choosing Yenkain, for instance, was that she would represent a strong female response. And again, these are suggested. There were thousands of women's faces we could choose, but there was something powerful in this gaze of Yenkain to the camera. The character of Ngeni, the Alusi figure. Okay, so what would the object, this carved figure that's been locked away in the museum stores for 100-year answer, and John being this character that, as it were, was called differently in the correspondence that we have around John, is mentioned in correspondence. He's sometimes referred to as my servant boy. He's sometimes referred to as my assistant. There is an interesting letter where after the tour, Thomas requests from the Colonial Office that he be kept on a retainer and be trained in photography. We don't know whether he actually was. So in his story, he's actually having a dialogue with another assistant, a Corporal Nimahan, who was a translator in that first tour. And the dialogue between them is with Nimahan telling this young boy not to forget who he is, because he's bound up, he's been, you know, serving Thomas, as it were, in lots of ways, not just his photographic assistant, but he's recorded playing his flute. We can imagine him as his kind of personal kind of, you know, servant. So the dialogue, as it were, that happens is the boy kind of awed by this world of the colonial white man and the possibility of becoming a photographer one day. And the character of Nimahan, who we also have a photograph of, reminding him to beware of the white man's promises. I suspect that there's no record of this retainer ever being paid. You know, one imagines that he was dropped after that tour, you know, yeah. But that's, I think, the value of storytelling. And I was working with West African storytellers, you know, and in storytelling, the realm of possibility is the key thing, I think, rather than, you know, the evidentiary, the factual necessarily. A work of imagination.
It's not history.
It's not claiming to be history.
Ask a follow-up question.
Yeah.
We talked about this a little last night. I had this question came up for me in yesterday's talk, and that is, yesterday you talked, and it was apparent today too, about, you know, the different affordances of the different media represented in this archive, and what each allows for different kinds of viewers. And so yesterday and today, coming out of this conversation, could you talk a little bit more about the difference between the affordances of the objects and other kinds of records, recordings, specimens, in Thomas's own terms, for historical reconstruction, and the affordances for current cultural production? And
Sure, yeah.
I mean, I think this is especially important for those of us at Bard Graduate Center, where we have historians and anthropologists. And I always think of, you know, this being one of the vectors in which we use the term material culture differently.
Mm-hmm.
Material culture in an anthropological sense as material manifestations of culture in the present, when most of us anthropologists work, versus material culture as a kind of non-textual form of evidence.
Yeah.
So that's my first question is really just, can you reflect a little bit more about who has used this archive for its historical evidentiary capacity,
Sure.
and who for contemporary cultural production?
And I'd just like to bring in that, but to go back to Ivan's point as well there about say Nick Thomas's idea of the museum methods as a kind of a broad kind of idea. And one of, you know, clearly one affordance of these materials is indeed kind of a historical, you know, evidentiary kind of thing. But for instance, in Nick Thomas's framework there, he talks of the museum as a creative technology. And by no means the exhibition is not a didactic historical exhibition. It's a provocation. It's a provocation to think with this legacy, this material legacy of these anthropological surveys in creative ways, drawing on indeed the metaphors that are implicit there, the broken pot. You know, the broken pot can speak. It can speak differently if we are, you know, depending on the kinds of questions we put to it. So it's an affordance of these things that if we take it outside of the purely historical kind of evidentiary kind of, you know, role as kind of epistemological objects, as the classical museum framing of what these things are, or archival framing, is of course expansive. So why should we reduce these things to that one role? The Oligon pot in its original thing wasn't about history or evidence. It wasn't about that. It was about containing powerful substance. So museums for the last 100 years have suppressed that and said that's irrational. Actually, what it is a vessel made of clay, made in 1909. It's this weight and it's this high, and it can tell us something about indigenous religion. But that would miss the whole point of what made that pot significant in its local context. Now, this isn't its local context, but it's another context. So I think working closely, I mean, I think this is why when I talk of an object-based approach, these are not things casually impressed on any of this stuff, but it's very much drawn out of a deep conversation with the photographs, with the sound recordings, with the objects, with the documents, and intimacy with them, and with other interlocutors who have other kinds of cultural knowledge about them. So I think it's about being, opening that up. Storytelling is a lot of the recordings that Thomas made were of stories. They're parables. You couldn't say, is that true that the tortoise and the monkey did that? No, it's not true. But there's a truth in the story, Can
I ask a follow-up question that actually anticipates your visit to my museum anthropology class on Friday? and that is, what's the curatorial strategy to point viewers to the fact that that's what they're looking at? That viewers who would come to the Museum of Anthropology at Cambridge to anticipating that evidentiary paradigm, either in the historical register or the ethnographic register.
Sure.
And what are the curatorial cues for them to think differently with the stuff?
They start with design. And indeed, the whole point is to subvert or to complement what you expect, because you come in from a very, the museum in Cambridge is a very traditional museum of archaeology and anthropology, where it's a didactic space where there are facts and objects are largely there as evidence supporting this kind of ethnographic or anthropological thing. You come into a space where, again, it's a whole other talk to give, but which we'll do on Friday with your students. It's not a white cube space, it's an entangled space where you can make out all of these kind of lines and so you feel you're entangled. And this comes from, again, the archive, the photographs of string games. So, string games almost a universal kind of thing, where again, you create these patterns and they are a rabbit going in a hole, and you go, right. It doesn't look like a rabbit going in a hole, but it might do to somebody. So anyway, so the design of the exhibition signals this. The fact that there are not didactic, explanatory labels. There are questions posed in text panels, for instance. There are juxtapositions of those problematic photographs with broken glass plate negatives blown up here. There's a shattered image. These are mirror frames, and at the bottom here is a shattered mirror with Thomas's image on. There's contemporary artworks which engage with this. There's all kinds of things like this. So it's using, if you like, the kind of a contemporary, you could think of it more as a contemporary art space, perhaps, that brings in these historical objects, images, sounds into play in a large kind of installation. In a way, you're entering an installation which provokes you to ask questions. What is the status of this historical material? What is the coloniality of it? These things were collected in these contexts. What does that matter? How does it matter? How are we to think about these things in the present?
Thank you. I want to ask you a question that relates to, you started with this concept of re-entanglement and the project as a whole, and you ended on the point of repurposing of anthropological colonial legacies, debris material for decolonial projects. And my question is, what and who is re-entangling with what and who, and what is being repurposed for what? And for me, a really striking example within this paper was when you took the portrait back to communities and you mentioned a lineage contest between leadership and a lineage that was more prominent than another, but then the impact of the portrait was for a lineage that more marginal to then stake a claim. To me, that's a profound potential re-entanglement of you and this material and a repurposing, not within our scholarship, but there. And so you obviously talking about lots of things and you moved on to the material, but I wondered, are you now implicated in that lineage contest? Is it ongoing? Are you implicated, entangled? Are you called into it by that group?
Yeah, I mean, not that specific case, but in a more general sense, absolutely. I mean, it's a little bit like Carmen said there, that she is thoroughly implicated in the history of this particular object and so on, and that its story is, you know, her intervention of that is matters. It's there. It's part of the object's biography, if you like. So the project as a whole, yes, it has been, you know, it's approaching the re-entanglements title. You know, on the one hand, this is about a historical view, and this picks up on, again, on Nick Thomas's book, Entangled Objects. So there's a kind of regarding the entanglement of this material with the colonial project. That's part of it. And then, of course, the other notion of re-entangling, as in the return to, you know, that we shouldn't seek to disentangle ourselves. And I think that matters for different positionalities, you know, my particular positionality, but, you know, anyone who comes into connection with this has a different relationship with it, depending on their positionality, their exact positionality, you know. So it's, you know, but and in some senses, that's about finding those affordances. So as again, we discussed yesterday's talk, part of the responsibility, as I put it, of the museum is to open up the possibility of these different, the almost infinite array of what these things afford to different people in different contexts for different purposes. And the job, as it were, of the museum is to open that wide rather than close it down. And again, I think what museums have been very good at for many, you know, for centuries is reducing down the meaning of things, you know, which goes a little bit perhaps to the question of, you know, the historical, you know, object. What can we say for sure, you know? So that kind of reduction to an epistemological kind of object of a certain kind of epistemology, it's about reversing that. And not only think about what this thing is, but what it does, but importantly for whom and in what circumstances, for what reasons. So it's, yeah, but I think, does that kind of answer your question?
I meant it like very practically,
yeah,
in unanticipated ways, beyond our own work and beyond perhaps the neutrality we'd like to be, say, as an anthropologist, and Thomas as well. I mean, Thomas, the 19th century colonial administrator, he has access to all of these different groups, right? So in a way, he's not in any of their politics. But once you've brought back a portrait that then feeds into, or, you know, potentially elevates one group into relation to another, beyond your own will or desire, you may then become implicated in that, or called upon into that.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering,
sure.
But did that actually happen?
I mean, Thomas was, of course, himself. He was championing in the story of the Ezenri. I was trying to say, he did take a position. He said, no, you have to understand the local cosmological order, and that we need to actually work with that, not just impress a colonial imposition on it. But in terms of my own, I am. There's no doubt about it, and the ethics of negotiating that is a challenging one, because, you know, in opening up affordances, you know, it's not policing that, you know, it's not for me to police, as it were, how one lineage instrumentalizes the image that they now have possession of, you know. What I've done is brought it there through my agency. It's now present in that community, you know. So I have to acknowledge that responsibility, and I think that's it's a challenging thing. And I you know, I can only say that it's about, you know, trying one's best to maintain this kind of integrity. And yeah, I mean, it is challenging, because what will be the consequences of that?
Yes.
But then what's the alternative? To say, oh, we couldn't possibly bring it there. People shouldn't be allowed to see their own history. I'm not suggesting you're suggesting that, but that's the other ethics, is to say, okay, what right have I got to police it, and to say, to withhold this material from this community for whom it seems to me it belongs most, because it may bring, you know,
but there are competing
negative
lineages. It's not one general community. So if one lineage asks you to take their side, would you take a side?
No, I don't think I would. I think I would say, I'm not actually telling you, you know, that there is this, I mean, talk about evidentiary, there is, that's a photograph of, you know, an individual photographed in 1914, who was then the paramount chief of that particular town. They didn't learn that was their, you know, that their ancestor had been that paramount chief. That was, everyone knew that, but somehow there was a power to that image that shifted the politics. So, but I don't know, I wouldn't. I mean, I was talking to all sides in that particular case, you know, but yeah, I mean, often one's in a position of competing ethics, I suppose, you know, and the easiest thing is to do nothing, of course, not to take any of this stuff back, not to, you know, interfere, but we do, you know, and I think that you know, on balance, I feel it's right to bring these materials to the people for whom it embodies their kind of heritage.
Two questions, both from our PhD students who are watching remotely. One, I'll ask the one that I think follows more closely on this conversation first. On the reconservation of the Oligon pot, I recall that you said the conservator did not intend to erase the damage, but sought to restabilize the piece. I was curious if the conservation process might have erased or reversed a history of local community care. I mean, you said it was unclear when the previous work had been done, or more broadly, in your thinking and work with Thomas's collection, was a history of local community care considered as an affordance? That is, I think I'm parsing now, the objects that have traces of pre-collection interventions, and
sure,
were there cases where that emerged as?
Definitely. No, so I mean, we know that the pot was broken after Thomas collected it. We have a photograph. I think I probably showed a photograph of it after it had been collected, but before it had been shipped. So it was a field photograph that he took of the object of the pot. So the damage was done through, I'm quite certain it was through transportation, but there's many other ceramic pots. Again, I showed some pictures yesterday that were smashed basically in transport, and they haven't been repaired. They were often not ritual pots like this one. So we know that it happened as a result of collecting, transportation, or indeed it could have been broken in the museum itself, you know. So we learned a great deal, as one does as a conservator, about the pot through that process. And particularly, one of the things we know about these shrines is that often shrines are activated through medicinal kind of means and ritual means and so on. And indeed, there was a kind of what only became apparent when it was deconstructed was there was this kind of void in which there was some organic matter. So it's likely that in the making process that it was kind of partly activated, although the final activation would be done on a shrine, and I don't think it ever served, as it were, on a shrine. There were many cases also where collected objects had been repaired, prior to collection. You know, you could see there's actually another a maiden spirit mask, also an Igbo kind of object that's in the display. You can clearly see it's a local repair, for instance.
Thanks. I think that was the nature of the question. The other question that we have posted here was, thank you very much for the wonderfully insightful talk. I was wondering if you might talk a little bit more about how the research and the activities with the descendant communities maybe influencing museum practice and the various archives that hold this material at home in the UK. Has there been any, you know, sort of feedback into the institutions in terms of their own understanding of their collections? I'm now building on the question as worded. But you know, are they expanding their databases? Are they insights
all
filtering
that
back
stuff,
into
that kind of very immediate kind of thing about what we know about this particular collection, for sure. I mean, as I say, no one had, with the sound recordings, no one had listened to them, been able to listen to them. Even when they were digitized, there was no one at the British Library who spoke these languages. And it's not even, you know, these are languages as spoken 100 years ago. And there's a, you know, so one's has to do a lot of very hard work, very locally with elders usually, in even to hear what's being said. It's, you know, so that kind of knowledge. I think in a more broad sense, I think, yeah, I mean, I think it's attracted quite a lot of attention from within the museum world as a kind of, certainly with the anthropological museum world anyway, about a kind of, you know, as something, as an exemplar of how we can think differently about how we work with collections. I mean, the challenge is that the kind of resources required to do the kind of field work, which is absolutely at the heart of this, none of it could happen. I would never have wanted to think of the exhibition or these kind of things had it not been grounded in actually going to the communities, but also other stakeholders. You know, we spoke a lot yesterday about our work with different artists in West Africa, for instance, and their engagement with these kinds of things. So these plurality of engagements in different localities, diasporic ones in the very villages where Thomas went, in urban centers in Nigeria, in all of these different kinds of spaces. So it's extremely expensive, to put it crudely, to be able to do that. So to scale this up to, you know, to think of a, you know, a museum collection as a whole is kind of almost unthinkable. But it gives a sense of, with a coherent body of material, which is still an expansive collection, the kinds of things one might try, you know. And it's an experiment. It's posing questions. It's not providing answers. It's using this material to think with.
You inadvertently answered one of the other questions posted, which was, given the sort of vast and rich sound documentation, why do you think people haven't explored that resource more up until now? And I think you actually answered that question.
Yeah, and we are. I mean, there's
inaccessibility
10 PhD projects actually to do it even more. I mean, we've touched, with all of this material, we've touched the kind of the tip of the iceberg kind of thing. Every community, there's a few recordings for each community, and what amazing work to be done still in really unpacking it all. But
we have time for one more question if anyone wants to think of one. Jeffrey, and I'd actually rather defer to
two quick ones.
Two quick ones, and then I'll just answer one more posted question, which is just logistical. Claude?
The woman Yenge had a rather remarkable soliloquy monologue performed by a contemporary person in English. And it seemed structured like a theatrical speech with a crescendo of, and if you come uninvited with me and my sisters into our private observances, you would have been bitten, spit out. Who constructed that? I expect those were not her words. How was that constructed and by whom? Was it by a playwright, a play person?
Storyteller, Sierra Leonean storyteller. You know, as I was mentioning earlier, so we have the words of one of those characters, and in fact, the words of only one person who we know. You know, we've got a named individual, and we know that person's words. That was that character, Onyeso. So we have the face, and we have the words he spoke. Yeah. No, those were his own words. For the other four characters, which represent the thousands of others, as it were, we worked with storytellers to imagine. We drew what we knew about these characters from the archival sources, but then we, you know, in an imaginative way, used storytelling to give them a voice. Okay.
So were they collaboratively scripted?
Yeah.
I mean, was it kind of a workshop that resulted in the script? That
we worked on it together. There's, I mean, the kind of key person there was a guy called Yusufu Jallo, who is a Sierra Leonean storyteller, and he's from one of the areas that Thomas went. So yeah, he was the key person, really.
Thank you.
Jeffrey, and I was just going to say that to this question that's coming up about how you signal the kind of intervention that you're making. You know, I'm glad you talked about the limited view of the museum installation, which seems very, very evocative and powerful. And I just was thinking when we were looking at that particular video of Yenke, that you're doing a lot of things to make clear that you are juxtaposing past and present, switching between them, and the kind of clouds that pass. You know, the pixelated episodes. You know, I think give you a sense that we're reaching across distance and approximating, and there's interruptions. And it reminded me in a strange way of the work of Glenn Ligon when he was doing his paintings of the fugitive slave ads, in which you read very carefully, and all of a sudden you realize that he's describing himself in, you know, a kind of sort of current, you know, hoodie or sweatshirt or whatever he was wearing. And so that ambiguity is part, you know, the moment where we're thinking like, what voice are we hearing here? What is the relationship between the 20th, this was, I think, 20th century and the 19th. And of course, one of the ways he used was to hand paint this thing at a different scale, and it was hanging on the wall of the Whitney. So there were a lot of signals about what it was.
Yeah.
And I suspect that we're not maybe picking up on all the signals
Sure,
that you provided for us to show how.
Yeah, I mean, that idea of breaking through somehow from that past. But I mean, one of them was carving, speaking. I don't think there's any question that this is an imaginative intervention. This whole thing is an intervention. It's not, it's, you know, it foregrounds itself. It's this, the thing is set up, trying to make clear the process of drawing out metaphors, making juxtapositions to provoke something. So yeah, it would be hard to mistake it for a didactic, informational type of exhibition. But yeah, those kinds of things, perhaps I take for granted that, you know, that in the whether it's these kind of interference or.
Just one last comment. One of the things I loved, sort of on a related point, is I love the idea, speaking of affordances, that there was this disconnect in a way between the agenda of the government that appointed Thomas and then what he wanted to do. And so that from the very beginning, there was the things were not the possibilities of what was being provided were not what the government wanted. And it made me very curious, you know, what did the government expect? You know, what did it think they were going to get? And was it going to be useful?
It's a whole other talk in itself, but indeed, you know, this was a first experiment, and the anthropology community in the UK had been lobbying for 20 years about how useful they'd be to the colonial.
And did they say exactly why? You know, this will help you with this.
Well, because of this issue of indirect rule, okay, which was reliant on intelligence knowledge about the local political structures, because that was what you needed to interface with. And they did it, of course, they did it in a very superficial way, because they looked for compliant elites. And if they didn't find a compliant elite, they'd remove the non-compliant elite and find someone who was compliant. And that's so in Nigeria, you had these what were called warrant chiefs, who were often not from chiefly lineages at all. They were compliant, powerful people who had a very ambiguous position, working across, they were local on the one hand, but they were in the service of the colonial authorities. And the descendants of many of those are still the elites, so there's a lot of politics underneath there, but which again points towards John's story of living in these different worlds, try to bring out a little bit of that in that character. But indeed, they didn't know, and they left it to Thomas to actually design his own itineraries, which, so the next iteration of government anthropology in the UK, which happened, after the First World War, it was actually the training of colonial administrators in anthropology. So they were first primarily administrators with an anthropological training, whereas Thomas wasn't an administrator at all. He was just an anthropologist, There's a lot more to tell you about that. I mean, anthropologists rejected Thomas as well. I mean, Malinowski, in the 1920s, used Thomas as an example of, antiquarian, kind of old-fashioned Victorian anthropology, the kind of thing we're creating a new discipline to get away from. So, he was sidelined, and he's, been a, much maligned character and disappeared from kind of anthropological history. But we know him through these collections now.
Okay, bring us to a close. I would say, for the benefit of our online viewers, there have been some references to yesterday's talk. So Paul gave a lunchtime talk here, which was not recorded and will not be available online. So sorry about that. But thank you all for joining us in the room and on Zoom, and join me in thanking Paul for the stimulating.
Thank you very much.